The rope that once bound him now bound his overseer to a dark, unrelenting death. In the deep, oppressive heat of a forgotten plantation, a figure emerged from the shadows, silent, methodical, yet burning with a rage that had festered for years. Beneath the flickering light of a lantern, the sounds of night outside seemed to grow dimmer, as if the world held its breath. The overseer, once a man in full command, felt nothing at first but the weight of the air. It was a humid, stifling night, and the slightest breeze felt like an unfamiliar touch. As he stood in the corner of the stable, inspecting the tools, the rope coiled in front of him seemed almost like an afterthought, an inanimate object left forgotten in a time of labor and cruelty. But that rope, it had a history, and it had witnessed pain, but tonight it would witness something far worse. The night would soon bleed into horror. This was the night the overseer would face the fury of a man he thought of as nothing but property. A man whom he had brutalized, humiliated, and degraded. A man whose pain he never saw, whose suffering never registered in his heart. And yet now, as the rope tightened around his neck, the overseer could only wonder, had it always been in the shadows, waiting? Had the slave's hands, so skilled with the tools of the plantation, longed to grasp this one? This rope, which was both the instrument of his own bondage and the very tool of his master's undoing. There was no time to think, no room for regrets. The slave moved too fast, too silently. The overseer's last breath came with a final, desperate struggle against the rope. But it was useless. The cruel and mocking smile he had so often worn, now locked in a death mask. And with that final, terrible moment, the balance of power on the plantation would never be the same. Who was this slave? What drove him to such an act of violent revenge? How could one man, bound by chains, end the life of one who thought himself untouchable? The answers were hidden in the shadows. This is a tale of revenge, brutality, and the unbearable weight of cruelty. As the lantern light flickered and the rope slackened, so did the overseer's hold on life. But what happened next, and the legacy of what had transpired, would echo for years to come, because revenge was never truly complete until the whole world knew the story. Stick around, because this is just the beginning. But to understand this story, we must first walk the cold, blood-stained ground where it all began. The slave's hands were not always meant to strangle. They were once used for work, for labor. To pick the cotton, to sow the fields, to serve at the whims of men whose names were forgotten by time, but whose cruelty still lingered in the rustling of the southern winds. But when that rope was laid in his hands, it became something far more than a simple tool. It became the harbinger of something darker, something more profound, a final violent act in a long string of injustices. Before we explore that fateful night, let us go back, far back, to a time of unfathomable darkness, where the rules of life and death were often written in blood. To understand the brutality of the night that changed everything, we must first step back into a world soaked in sweat, blood, and fear, where cruelty was commonplace, and hope was a fleeting whisper that often died long before it reached the ears of those who needed it most. The year was 1856. The American South, with its sprawling plantations and oppressive sun, was a land where human life had become commodified, measured only by the worth of its labor. And labor in the eyes of those who ruled the land was synonymous with a chain, an iron chain wrapped tightly around the body and the spirit, so that no matter how far one traveled, they were always tethered to their place, their role, their oppression. Picture the scene: acres of cotton fields stretching endlessly under the sun, the air thick with humidity, the soil rich but demanding. The land seemed endless, like a kingdom all its own, a place where wealth and power were built from the back-breaking labor of those who had no say in their fate. The plantation was both a haven for the rich and a prison for the poor, those enslaved, whose bodies were owned, whose lives were not their own. The owners of these plantations, typically white men with inherited wealth or newly gained fortune, were detached from the daily struggles of the laborers. Their estates were grand, sometimes bordered by elegant homes filled with fine furniture, music, and art. the kind of luxuries only the most privileged could afford. But outside the towering gates, on the edges of the manicured lawns, in the fields that stretched far into the distance, was another world, a world of misery and toil. The overseer, a man of relatively low standing but high cruelty, was the key figure in enforcing this system of slavery. It was his duty to ensure that the laborers worked from sunup to sundown, producing crops for the owner's profit, and he did so with fear and violence as his tools. The overseer was tasked with making sure no one slacked off, no one attempted to run, and no one dared to speak against their treatment. If you've heard the phrase whip in hand, it was not merely a metaphor for control. It was a brutal physical truth. These overseers, often drawn from the lower ranks of society, were given authority over the lives of those they ruled. Many of them, though not wealthy themselves, found power in the dominance they could exert. They were rarely kind men. Instead, they were quick to lash out, using violence as their primary means of maintaining control. In the fields, it was said that the whip was the overseer's most faithful companion, and a slow, deliberate brutality was employed to teach slaves that resistance was futile. But it wasn't only the overseer's cruelty that permeated the plantation. It was the weight of the entire system, an unending cycle of fear, violence, and hardship that crushed the spirit. To be a slave was to be a thing, a mere tool in the eyes of the plantation owner. It didn't matter who you were before your capture, your history, your name, your family. All of it was erased when you were shackled to the land. Men, women, and children were taken from their homelands, often forcibly, and sold into servitude, their futures bound by iron chains. Some were brought over from Africa, others from the Caribbean, but all were treated the same. They were told when to wake, when to sleep, and when to work. They were stripped of their autonomy, reduced to tools for labor, their worth measured only by what they could produce. And yet, in the midst of this bleakness, there were moments of resilience. There were whispers of resistance, small acts of rebellion that gave hope to those who had none. Quiet defiance was often the only escape. The human spirit, even when crushed under the weight of years of suffering, found ways to flicker. It is in the context of this world that we meet our main character, the slave who would one day rise up against the man who ruled him. His name is lost to history, as so many others were, but his actions would resonate long after he was gone. He was born into the very system that sought to destroy him. Like so many, he came to the plantation a stranger, his past a memory too painful to recall. His family, if they were ever in his life, had been torn apart, scattered to different corners of the fields. His identity was no longer his own. He was a number, a name lost in the records of property, another body to be worked until it broke, then replaced. His days began before dawn, his hands rough from years of toil in the sun. He would have known the sting of the overseer's whip on more than one occasion, the bruising heat of the sun pressing down on his back. He worked the fields, picked cotton, planted crops, each day a blur of exhaustion and pain. But his mind never dulled. He watched, listened, and waited. He saw how the overseers walked with arrogance, how they thought themselves untouchable, immune to the suffering they caused. He saw how their cruelty was normalized, passed down from generation to generation, how the slave masters made sure to instill fear, to make sure no one ever rose up, no one ever fought back. And then he saw something else, the way his fellow slaves would sometimes come together, in secret, and share quiet words of resistance. They spoke of freedom, of escape, of vengeance. Some had seen escape, others had tried, but always they were hunted down, beaten or worse. But the idea had been planted in his mind, a seed that would grow. As the sun set each day, the sounds of the plantation would change. The hustle of the fields would die down, and a haunting silence would settle over the land. In the distance, you could hear the creaking of the slave quarters, the rustling of leaves in the trees, the low murmur of voices coming from hidden corners of the compound. In the main house, the master would retire to the comfort of his dining room, sipping wine, discussing business. In the quarters, however, the air was thick with whispered stories, prayers, and dreams of freedom. The shadows that stretched long over the fields, weren't just the result of the setting sun. They were the shadows of something far more sinister. The tension in the air was palpable. Every day a new moment could turn violent. One slip-up, one accusation of insubordination, one moment of defiance, and the overseer's whip would find its target. In this volatile atmosphere, every interaction carried weight. But for the slave, it wasn't just the physical pain that made the days unbearable. It was the mental anguish, the constant degradation, the constant reminder that he was nothing more than an object, a thing. This cycle of abuse would wear down even the strongest of men. It is within this environment, under the suffocating weight of years of suffering, that the final straw was drawn, the moment when the rope, that simple tool of the overseer, became a symbol of something far more terrifying. It would take only one spark to ignite the fury of a man who had been pushed too far. The stage was set, the die was cast. The days before the fateful night were like any other on the plantation. The sun burned relentlessly over the fields, its heat crawling under the skin, seeping deep into the bones of those who worked beneath it. The overseer's shadow lingered constantly. Every step they took, every breath they drew, was watched. The whip never strayed far, its presence felt in every moment of silence. But that silence, in the hours before dusk, was sometimes the most deafening. The overseer had no compassion, no sympathy. To him, the slaves were nothing more than tools. Tools that could be discarded or replaced when broken. He'd grown accustomed to the sight of their backs bent under the weight of the work. He'd long stopped seeing them as human beings. It was in the small moments, those seemingly insignificant exchanges, that his cruelty was most evident. When a slave faltered, perhaps from fatigue, perhaps from injury, the overseer was there, quick to lash out. His whip cracked through the air, and the sharp sting of leather on skin would follow, as predictable as the turning of the earth beneath their feet. He'd laugh as he delivered his punishment, cruelly enjoying the sound of skin being torn, the gasps of breath that followed, the choking sobs that echoed through the fields. The overseer's cruelty was not just physical. It seeped into everything. He reveled in the power of his position, how easily he could manipulate the fear in their eyes, how quickly he could reduce even the strongest of men to quivering shadows of themselves. His grip on power was absolute, like a storm on the horizon that never quite arrived, yet left the air thick with its threat. But as much as the overseer believed he held control, there were moments, fleeting though they were, where the weight of his power seemed less certain. These were moments shared in silence between the slaves, exchanges that carried more than just words. In the late hours, when the overseer had retreated to his quarters to drink away the day's frustrations, a few of the slaves would meet under the cover of darkness. Sometimes it was in the woods beyond the fields, or between the rows of the crops, where the sounds of the night could shield them. Sometimes it was just in the corners of the slave quarters, their voices kept low. These secret meetings were small, quiet acts of resistance. They didn't call for open rebellion. They didn't plan for dramatic acts of violence. Instead, they spoke of freedom, of hope, of escape. They whispered of rebellion, not as a desperate plea, but as a quiet fire that burned in the hearts of a few and grew in the hearts of more. The slave who would one day strangle the overseer was one of these men. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his words were measured, deliberate. He was known among the other slaves as a man of few words but sharp eyes. He watched more than he spoke, listened more than he acted. His anger, which had been building for years, was a slow, smoldering thing, yet within it there was also a calculated calm. He had seen enough to know how the overseer operated, how he relished his cruelty, how he thrived on the submission of others. He had watched as the overseer whipped, beat, and bullied those weaker than him. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the women, the weariness in the faces of the men. But what cut the deepest, what twisted the knife in his soul, was how the overseer treated the children, how he mocked their youth, how he forced them into labor too heavy for their small bodies. The overseer had once struck a boy no older than 12, a boy who had merely hesitated for a moment to catch his breath. He'd seen it, and something in him had snapped. That night, he vowed that no one, no matter how far removed from the overseer's grip, would ever again have to endure that kind of abuse. As the days stretched on, the overseer's presence became heavier. His cruelty only intensified. One day, a slave woman, too weak from the work, had collapsed in the fields. The overseer had come upon her, furious at her delay. He hadn't given her the chance to speak, hadn't shown any concern for her condition. Without a word, he raised the whip and struck her across the back, and when she screamed, he did it again. Her body lay there in the dirt, blood staining the earth beneath her. No one dared to move. No one dared to interfere. The air that evening was thick with anger. The other slaves, who had witnessed the scene from a distance, had done nothing. The terror of retaliation was too great. But for the slave who had been quietly watching, the terror was no longer enough to hold him back. The overseer's actions had crossed a line that could not be ignored. The slow burn of his anger had reached its boiling point, and now it threatened to consume everything in its path. He knew what he had to do, but it was not yet the right moment. There was a tool the overseer kept close, a rope. It was a simple thing, used to bind the hands of the slaves before they were forced to work, to tie them when they were punished. But to the slaves, it was more than just a tool of restraint. It was a symbol of control, of power, of the unrelenting oppression they faced each day. It was the very thing that kept them bound to the land, to their suffering. The slave who had long harbored his resentment toward the overseer now began to see the rope differently. He began to imagine it in a new light, not as a tool of submission, but as an instrument of his revenge. He watched it closely, saw how it coiled and uncoiled in the hands of the overseer. It was always close by, always just out of reach, but one day it would be within his grasp. The days passed, and still, the overseer's cruelty continued. He would make threats against those who dared to speak back, increasing the pressure on the slaves. Yet, each moment of suffering only strengthened the resolve of the man who would become his executioner. It was on the eve of a particularly brutal day, a day when the overseer had driven his workers beyond exhaustion, that something shifted. The overseer had forced the slaves to work late into the night, beyond the point of fatigue, beyond the point of reason. He had struck another one of the men for a minor infraction, the sting of the whip reverberating through the air, a sound as familiar to the slaves as the heartbeat in their chests. The slave who had been waiting for this moment saw it. He saw the overseer standing there, confident, proud of his power, utterly unaware of the storm building in the eyes of the man he had so long tortured. It was then that the final seed of his revenge was planted. The rope lying on the ground, coiled and ready, would be the instrument of the death he had planned for so long. He approached it slowly, quietly. No one noticed him at first. He wasn't the fastest nor the strongest, but he was focused, and tonight he would not be stopped. The night was oppressive. The full moon hung low over the plantation, casting long shadows that stretched across the fields like fingers of darkness, creeping and curling through the underbrush. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sharp, acrid sting of sweat. Human sweat, animal sweat, mingling together in the stifling humidity. The only sounds that filled the air were the distant cries of the cicadas, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the soft thud of footsteps as they moved across the ground. Everything felt wrong. The plantation, usually so alive with the noise of labor, had become eerily quiet. The overseer had retired to his quarters, sure of his position, certain that the day's work would lead to a night of rest. But in the corners of the fields, in the dark recesses of the slave quarters, a different kind of work was beginning to take shape. The slave who had long plotted this night was moving, but he moved with a purpose now, his steps deliberate, measured. There was no panic, no desperation in his movements. His anger had given way to something more calculated, cold, precise, inevitable. He had waited years for this moment, and now, the moment had finally come. The rope, the very rope that had been used to bind him, to humiliate him, to degrade him, was now his to use. It was no longer a symbol of servitude, but of retribution. He could almost feel its weight in his hands, as if it pulsed with the same anger that simmered in his chest. He could almost hear it whisper to him, urging him forward. And in his mind, there was no going back. Inside the overseer's quarters, the man was drunk. The taste of whiskey still lingered on his tongue as he slurred through his thoughts, too clouded to see the danger lurking outside. He had enjoyed a drink after a long day of cracking his whip, savoring the control he held over his workers, the absolute dominance he wielded with each lash. The fire of alcohol dulled his senses, made the world feel a little softer, a little more manageable. The overseer leaned back in his chair, his feet up on the wooden table, the dim light of a lantern flickering beside him. He chuckled to himself, the sound hollow and empty, a bitter mockery of his own existence. The air inside the room was warm and heavy, the windows cracked open just enough to let a small breeze pass through. The plantation house felt alive with the heat of the day, the walls seeming to close in on him. He wiped his brow, reached for the bottle again. But then he stopped. There was a shift in the air, a sudden pressure that pressed down on him like a vice. His senses, still dulled by the alcohol, didn't register the change immediately. It was the smallest of sounds that first alerted him. A soft creak, the floorboards shifting, a whisper in the darkness. His head jerked toward the door, eyes narrowing in suspicion. He stood up quickly, reaching for the pistol he kept on the mantel. But before he could move, the door swung open. The slave appeared in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the faint light of the moon that leaked through the window. For a moment the overseer hesitated, his heart thudding against his chest. He'd seen this man before, of course. He had watched him from the shadows, saw the quiet rage in his eyes, the way he always seemed to be just on the edge of breaking. But the overseer never thought it would come to this, never thought that this man, the one he had tormented for so long, would dare step into his quarters, into his domain. What do you want?" The overseer slurred, his voice thick with alcohol. He reached for the pistol, his hands trembling. But before he could grab it, the slave stepped forward. There was no fear in the slave's eyes, only a cold, implacable fury. The overseer's breath caught in his throat. He staggered backward, but the man was too fast. The whip, that cruel instrument of control, that had struck his back countless times, now lay coiled in the slave's hands, not as a weapon of torture, but of execution. The rope was there too, draped over his shoulder like an ominous promise. The overseer's breath hitched as the realization set in. This was no ordinary confrontation. The overseer had never felt such a terrifying sense of vulnerability. His arrogance, his sense of invincibility, had been shattered in a single instant. "You've taken everything from me," the slave said, his voice calm, but laced with the tension of years of suffering. "Tonight I take it back." The overseer's mouth fell open in disbelief as the slave closed the distance between them, his movements swift, fluid. The overseer's hand fumbled for the pistol, but it was too late. In an instant the slave was on him, his hands grabbing the overseer's throat, fingers wrapping around it with a strength the overseer never expected. It wasn't like any fight the overseer had ever been in. It wasn't wild or desperate. It wasn't a struggle for survival. No, this was deliberate. This was a slow, measured act of retribution. The slave didn't scream. He didn't fight. He simply held on, watching as the overseer's eyes widened in terror, as his hands clawed at the rope that was tightening around his neck. The overseer tried to scream, but the sound was caught in his throat. His breath came in sharp, desperate gasps as he tried to wrench himself free, his body thrashing against the slave's iron grip. But there was no escape, no mercy. His vision began to fade, his body growing weaker, as the pressure around his neck continued to build. The rope tightened with every passing second, choking the life from him, cutting off the air that once filled his lungs. In the final moments, the overseer's face was a twisted mask of panic and disbelief. His hands, now trembling and weak, scraped at the rope, but it was useless. The slave was too strong, too resolute. The overseer's eyes, once filled with arrogance, now held only terror. Terror at the realization that he had misjudged this man. terror that his cruelty, his relentless abuse had led to this moment. And then, with a final brutal twist, the overseer's body went limp, his head falling to one side, his lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. The slave held on a moment longer, just to be sure. He let the stillness settle over the room, the oppressive silence that followed the overseer's death. It was done. The slave released the rope and stepped back. His hands were slick with sweat, his heart pounding, but he did not allow himself to relax. Not yet. The overseer's body slumped in the chair, a pitiful, lifeless thing. The room seemed to close in on the slave, the air thick with the scent of blood and death. For a long moment he stood there, breathing heavily, as if waiting for something. Perhaps a sign that what he had done was right, that his vengeance was justified. But there was no sign. There was only the sound of his own breath and the quiet that now reigned over the plantation. The slave knew he had changed the balance of power forever. The overseer would not rise again. No one would ever again be forced to endure his cruel hand. And yet, as he stood there in the stillness of the room, there was no joy in his victory, only the cold, hard knowledge that revenge, though sweet, was never enough to erase the years of suffering, the pain that had carved deep grooves into his soul. The death of the overseer did not create the violent uproar that one might expect. There was no immediate explosion of chaos, no loud, chaotic clash between the enslaved workers and the plantation's owners. Instead, there was a heavy silence, a silence that hung over the plantation like a suffocating blanket, thick and oppressive. The air, which had once been filled with the sounds of labor, now seemed too still. The fields, as far as the eye could see, stretched out in endless rows, silent as the tomb. The slave who had carried out the act of revenge disappeared into the shadows of the night, retreating to the unknown parts of the plantation. There were no cheers, no cries of triumph, only the quiet realization that the overseer, the symbol of fear and cruelty, was gone. His lifeless body remained in the chair, a grotesque testament to the act that had just occurred. The plantation, for the first time in a long while, seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't long before the body was found. The next morning, a few of the other overseers, some who worked on the neighboring estates, others who had simply come to visit, arrived at the plantation. The head of the estate was an older man with an air of indifference to the suffering of those he ruled over. But even he couldn't ignore the sight that awaited him in the overseer's quarters. His body, still slumped in the chair, the rope still dangling loosely around his neck. There was a brief moment of confusion, a whisper, a stutter of disbelief, and then panic set in. The overseer, a man feared by the slaves and other workers alike, was dead. The cause of death was clear, but no one had seen it happen. There were no witnesses, no obvious clues as to the identity of the person responsible. The plantation owner, after the initial shock, flew into a rage. His anger echoed across the property as he began to make frantic, wild accusations. It wasn't uncommon for a slave to be punished for even a minor infraction, and the death of an overseer, the very person meant to enforce discipline, was beyond the scope of his understanding. How had this happened? Who had done it? What was their motive? But the answer was not clear. The tension between the enslaved workers and the overseers had always been palpable. The overseer was hated, and yet the owner knew that if the rebellion had begun, if the slaves had turned on their overseers, he could lose control over the entire estate. His wealth, his very lifestyle was at risk. The questions piled upon him like a storm gathering on the horizon. The panic of the owner quickly turned to action. He ordered the remaining overseers to question the slaves, demanding information. The entire plantation went into lockdown. No one was to leave. No one was allowed to speak unless it was to answer questions about the overseer's death. But despite the growing hysteria, no one came forward. Fear paralyzed the slaves. No one spoke. They had learned the hard way that to do so could be fatal. Even those who had witnessed acts of violence, even those who had been under the overseer's lash, remained silent. They knew that speaking out could lead to their own deaths, or worse, the deaths of their family members. The plantation owner's frustration grew. He doubled down, ordering every slave to be questioned, every person to be interrogated. He began threatening them all with unimaginable punishments: whips, chains, starvation. The names of the conspirators would be dragged out of the shadows, he swore. He would make sure of it. But the silence remained. The killing of the overseer had been so swift, so efficient, that it left nothing but dread in its wake. The whispers about it began to spread like wildfire. Some believed it was a random act of violence, a crime of passion. Others speculated that the slaves had finally had enough and struck back. Yet, in the face of all these questions, nothing changed. The owner could do nothing but watch as his plantation slowly unraveled under the weight of its own dark history. The sense of dread grew. The owner, unable to pinpoint who had committed the murder, turned his wrath on the entire plantation. He gathered the slaves together, standing before them with a trembling voice, demanding answers. His anger was palpable, and though the slaves remained still, the tension in the air was thick with fear. They knew what was coming. The message was clear: someone must pay. The overseer's death could not go unpunished. The cruelty of the punishment would have to match the magnitude of the crime. The owner had already decided he would set an example. He would show that no slave, no matter how much suffering they had endured, could ever escape the reach of his authority. For several days, the plantation was paralyzed with fear. No one dared to speak openly. The usual routine of labor ceased as the workers grew too fearful to move freely. Even the threat of the lash couldn't force them to speak. If anything, it only deepened their resolve to keep quiet. But in the background, things were already shifting. There was an energy, an undercurrent of change, building in the hearts of the slaves. The death of the overseer, while terrifying, had sparked something else, something long buried beneath years of oppression. The idea of resistance, of revenge, began to take root. More and more of the enslaved workers started to share quiet words of defiance. The idea that one of their own had risen up and struck back against the cruel overseer was a spark of hope in the darkness. It was, of course, a dangerous hope, a fragile one, but it was enough to make the air feel different. Despite the terror and the rage that followed the overseer's death, something unexpected began to happen. The plantation started to fall apart. The crops, once flourishing under the overseer's whip, began to wither. The workers, once driven by fear and desperation, now worked slower. Their hands, once quick and nimble, moved more deliberately as if in protest. The owner noticed this, of course. His frustration grew as he saw his wealth, his prized crops, begin to wither in the fields. The whispers of rebellion that had begun to take hold were impossible to ignore. But he did nothing to stop it. He was too consumed by his own wrath, too blinded by the desire for vengeance to see that he was losing control of his own estate. Word of the overseer's death spread. The fear that once kept the slaves in line began to crack. Small, quiet rebellions, scattered throughout the land, started to emerge. The legacy of the overseer's death became something more than just an act of revenge. It became a symbol of what was possible. And slowly, painfully, the very foundation of the plantation system began to crumble. Years have passed since that fateful night, but the death of the overseer still lingers in the air around the plantation, like an unspoken secret. The once thriving estate is now little more than a decaying relic of a bygone era. The fields that were once teeming with life now lie dormant, their soil thick with the rot of abandonment. The grand house, once a symbol of wealth and power, has fallen into disrepair, its windows shattered, its walls crumbling. Nature has slowly reclaimed what man had tried to control. But the story of that night, the night the overseer was strangled by his own rope, has never quite been forgotten. It has become a ghost story, whispered between generations, passed down in fragments like the broken pieces of a forgotten truth. The questions surrounding the overseer's death have never been answered. Who was the slave who struck the fatal blow? Was he truly the only one behind the act, or was there a greater conspiracy brewing among the oppressed? Did the overseer's death spark a larger rebellion, or was it simply a lone act of vengeance that vanished into the dark corners of history? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, did the overseer's death truly bring about the justice that the slaves had longed for? Or did it only deepen the blood-soaked history of the land, a history that could never truly be erased? What remains is the shadow of a single act of vengeance, reverberating across time. The slave who carried out the act, his name long forgotten, his face lost to the mists of time, did what so many had dreamed of. He struck back against the forces that had held him captive. He ended the reign of a man who had taken everything from him. And in doing so, he shifted the balance of power, if only for a moment. But in the end, what did it accomplish? Did it set others free, or did it merely ignite a brief spark that was quickly snuffed out by fear, punishment, and reprisal? Was it justice, or was it a fleeting, bitter taste of something that would never be fully realized? It is said that when the plantation owner died, many years later, no one came to mourn him. His death was barely noticed by the surrounding community, a footnote in the long, painful history of the land. Perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest punishment of all, a life lived without legacy, without any memory of the power he had once wielded so ruthlessly. Some claim that the rope, the very one used to strangle the overseer, was never truly disposed of, that it remained in the shadows for many years after the act, passed from one generation to the next, each time carrying with it the weight of its history. It is said that anyone who touched it would be haunted by the echoes of that night, by the taste of vengeance, by the feeling of power gained at such a terrible cost. There are those who believe the rope still lingers somewhere on the land, hidden away in the remnants of the plantation. And on quiet moonlit nights, when the wind blows just right, you can hear the faint sound of its rustling through the trees, the whisper of the past calling out to those willing to listen. Some say it is the rope that waits, waiting for the next hand to grasp it, to continue the cycle of revenge. Others believe that the rope itself is cursed, bound to the land, unable to escape the bloodshed that marked its use. The story of the slave's revenge has become part of the local folklore, blurred between truth and legend. Some who remember the tale speak of the slave as a hero, a man who took the fate of his people into his own hands and struck back against the system that had oppressed them for so long. Others speak of him as a tragic figure, a man who, despite his righteous anger, could not escape the inevitable consequences of violence. The memory of the overseer, Hayas' death, still lingers in the minds of the old families who once owned the land. They speak of it in hushed tones, as if the very act of acknowledging it brings bad luck. They say that the spirit of the overseer still haunts the land, seeking vengeance for the injustice done to him, his ghost lingering like a shadow over the place he once ruled. But what is truth, and what is myth? No one can say for certain. The lines between the two have become too blurred, too entangled with the passage of time. The world that existed during those days, where violence and oppression were everyday occurrences, is one that few can truly understand now. And yet the echoes of that time remain, reverberating in the corners of our history. As we look back on the events that unfolded in those dark days, we are left with one lingering thought. Can the cycle of violence ever truly be broken? Can the legacy of oppression be erased? Or will it continue to bleed into the present, passed down like a curse from one generation to the next? The death of the overseer was a moment of triumph, a fleeting, brutal triumph over the forces that had sought to crush the spirit of those who labored beneath them. But it also serves as a reminder of the terrible costs of revenge. For even in victory, there is always a price to pay. The past is never truly gone. It lingers, haunting those who dare to look back. So as the years slip by and the world moves forward, the plantation stands as a broken monument to a history that can never be fully forgotten. The land may have shifted ownership, the faces of those who worked it may have changed, but the shadows of what happened there, the violence that tore through it, remain in the very earth itself. And who knows? Perhaps somewhere in the forgotten ruins of the plantation, the rope still waits. What if the true story, the real story, was never fully told? What if the slave who strangled his overseer with the family's own rope never truly got the justice he deserved? What if the whispers of that night are the only truth we will ever know? Perhaps there are more stories waiting to be uncovered, stories we haven't yet dared to unearth. But for now, we are left with a question. What price does history demand for vengeance? And who, if anyone, will ever answer that call?